I also like to remind everyone that tonight's webinar is recorded. If you don't mind being recorded, then leave your cameras on. If not, then you Thanks everyone for waiting. So let's begin. Welcome to the Pacific Australia's Youth Association's webinar on Australia's Solomon Islands Youth Climate Resilience and Cooperation. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Pacific Australia Youth Association acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. We have a couple of special guests in attendance tonight. We have for our online webinar tonight, and I would like to thank them for joining us tonight. First of all, we have Henry Puna, our Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. Tagya Tomas, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have apologies from Sally Ann. She was supposed to attend tonight, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. She is the Australian Deputy High Commissioner to Solomon Islands. So Secretary General, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hear from our panelists this evening. So first of all, before we start, I'd like to introduce myself and Paya. My name is Sabrina Habu, and I will be your moderator for tonight's Q&A panel. I am from the beautiful Isabel province in the Solomon Islands. I am currently a full-time law student at Macquarie University, studying under the Australian Award Scholarship, and I work part-time as a paralegal at Pacific Legal Network. For those of you who have never heard of Paya, allow me to introduce our group to you. As a youth-led organization, the Pacific Australia Youth Association, aka PAYA, seeks to foster effective engagement and collaboration amongst young leaders who share a common interest for the Pacific Australia region. We strive to contribute towards a more prosperous Pacific by building an engaged community united by our core values of connection, understanding, and opportunity. The Pacific Australia Youth Association exists to foster a deeper knowledge of the Pacific and Australia region by building meaningful relationships, connections, and community. So now I'd like to welcome our incredible group of young people lined up to share about how Australia and the Solomon Islands can share together to build climate resilience and cooperation. So let me introduce our panelists for this evening. First of all, we have Dylan Mail. Growing up on a farm in rural Australia, Dylan witnessed firsthand the many challenges facing our food production systems, particularly that of climate change. He quickly realized that a changing climate possesses significant risks to food security around the world and wanted to be part of the solution. This led to Dylan pursuing a career in agriculture science, where he is able to use science to help make our food systems become more climate resilient. Dylan is passionate about food security, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region, where he has undertaken work in Australia, Hawaii, PNG, and Solomon Islands. Dylan is currently undertaking his PhD with the University of Melbourne in Australia. Target to mas Dylan. Our next second panelist for tonight, we have Gladys Habu. Gladys is a hospital pharmacist by profession and a passionate advocate by heart who continues to raise awareness on matters of concern, particularly in the health and environment/climate change space. Her climate work focuses on amplifying voices of those directly affected by climate change, particularly in pushing for better representation of Pacific youth in global discussions aimed at bringing about solutions that addresses the root cause of climate change, as well as the loss and damage that local communities face. Some of her recent participation includes representing Pacific youth at the PIF's COP26 event in Glasgow last year in November, PIF's plenary event at the UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon this year in July, and as plenary keynote speaker at the 7th Global NAP Expo in Botswana a few days ago. Gladys was recognized in 2021 by Her Majesty the Queen as the 168th Commonwealth Point of Light awardee. She's also a pharmacy honours graduate from the Monash University in Australia and currently completing her master's in clinical pharmacy, international practice and policy at University College London in United Kingdom. Thank you, Thomas Gladys, for joining us from all the way from UK. Now moving on to our next panelist, we have Zhanae. Zhanae is a proud Gungaloo, Biri, Weedy and Kanja woman from Rockhampton, Central Queensland. In 2021, she was named Queensland Youth Premier and Youth Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. Zhanae is a court support worker and case manager with Darrumbal Community Youth Service Corporation, where she also established the after-hours service and drop-in centre. She is currently establishing her own small business, Groove Co, which is an advocacy, professional development, consultancy, and program delivery service focused on empowering Indigenous people. Zhanae studies a Bachelor of Agriculture in 2022 with Central Queensland University. She recently joined the Queensland Family and Child Commission Youth Advocacy Council this year as well, and is also a board member for Gumbi Gumbi Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Corporation. Zhanae was recently selected as an Australian delegate for the Young Pacific Leaders program organized by the US Department of State. And now, and thank you to Zhanae for joining us. And now moving on to our final panelist for tonight, we have Sharon Inone, which is Sharon is an environmental scientist from the Solomon Islands. She graduated with first-class honors, Masters in Science in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security at the National University of Ireland, Galway. As a delegate of Solomon Islands for COP24 and COP26, she is passionately firm on her mission and vision to not only represent Solomon Islands internationally, but importantly to translate the SDGs and the Paris Agreement into palatable developments in the rural, most poor and vulnerable communities in Solomon Islands and the Pacific region in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. Currently, Sharon works at the World Vision Sector Portfolio Manager for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction in the Solomon Islands, managing 4 resilient projects funded by USAID, BHA, DFAT, and WWF. Whew. Welcome everyone tonight. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Solomon Islands, in Queensland, Melbourne, and UK. Okay, so now, we move on to our first question for tonight. And this goes on to all our panelists. The first question is can you talk about some of the climate change resilience projects you have participated in, and what was the role of young people in this initiative? And also, how do you think the public and private sector can harness youth voices to drive climate solutions in Australia and the Solomon Islands?
Thank you, Sabrina. I think I can take it away and have a go at answering this question first. So thank you to the Pacific Oz Youth Association for inviting me along tonight, and thank you for everyone attending. My name is Dylan, and I guess my story and what kind of my first appreciation into the importance of climate resilience was my upbringing on a farm in rural Australia. So I grew up on a farm about 5 hours west of Sydney in the Riverina region of New South Wales. And I grew up in a time known as the Millennium Drought in Australia. And I grew up on a farm. We mainly were crop producers. So we grew rice, we grew wheat. We also had some livestock, sheep and cattle. And I really, growing up on a farm, I created like such a connection to the land. I loved being out on the farm all the time, watching food grow from crops. Although I saw the challenges that drought posed to farmers, and I just have these vivid imagery of big dust storms coming over the horizon and just eroding away all the incredibly precious topsoil that we have here in Australia, and seeing crops wither away from a lack of rain, kind of seeing livestock surrounding dams that had dwindled to no more than a puddle. And it was during this time of drought where my family, who had been kind of farming for generations, it kind of pushed them out of farming just because it was really difficult. So I kind of wanted to pursue a career where I could contribute towards providing solutions to address challenges facing food security, such as a changing climate. This led me to pursuing a career in agricultural science. So I studied Bachelor of Agricultural Science at Charles Sturt University in Australia. And during this time, I got to understand a bit more about the science of growing food. And I had opportunities to go out into the Asia Pacific region and engage in some climate resilient projects. For example, one of my first projects was with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. And I was undertaking work with some of the leading experts there in cropping, looking at building varieties of canola and wheat that were resistant to drought and heat stress, because into the future with climate change, there's going to be increasing extreme weather events such as drought and increased heat. So it's important that we're identifying kind of varieties of crops that can still produce food and yields despite increased stress. So I was really excited to be a part of that project. In 2019, I travelled to Papua New Guinea and worked on a project led by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research Agency. And during that project, I was working with farmers to develop control methods to control pests to sweet potato production. So in PNG and across other Pacific nations, sweet potato can be a staple food for communities. But with a changing climate, increased world population, it's adding increased stress from pests and disease. So it was really cool to kind of work with farmers in the community to kind of look at ways where we can control pests, which are becoming increasing a problem in a changing climate. In terms of the role in youth in these projects, a lot of these projects were led by experts. I was just, a researcher, but there's a lot I could learn from them. I think into the future, and especially highlighted in the recent UN Day for Youth, is that the world's population is increasingly made up of youth. So it's young people that are going to increasingly have their ideas and innovation to help drive change and address issues such as climate resilience in our food production systems and other areas. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Dylan. I'll let Gladys respond after this, and then Zhanae, and then we end up with Sharon. Thank you, Gladys.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dylan. That was so interesting. In fact, being in Botswana recently and seeing a lot of the young people also doing, food crops and planting, crops that actually withstand some of these extreme conditions have been so interesting to see. On my side, I think because I've been overseas studying, I haven't really been back home on the ground yet, but what I've been doing is involving in like various opportunities that come up to educate groups who are looking to fund projects back in the Pacific Islands, so in Solomon Islands, for example, Papua New Guinea. But back in the community in general, largely a lot of the stuff that the young people are involved in are very sort of simple, traditional measures to cope with, the loss and damage faced. So things like building stone walls, building our walkways on stilts, because by high tide we're just underwater, so we need our walkways to be on stilts through the mangroves, making it much easier. Also planting new mangroves as well along the coast to make sure that it holds from further erosion. And usually young people who are involved in this are able to earn some sort of small money. And a lot of the time, the money comes from the groups who like host whatever activity that they have, which is own pocket money, really. A lot of communities still struggle to access the funding that is out there for climate resilience. But with regards to how, I think there was the third question was on how public and private sector can harness youth voices. In this space, I think collaboration is the big word here, which often is mentioned by all sorts of groups, public, private sector, civil societies. However, I have not really, or often not seen it practiced in the way that brings justice to the meaning of the word. So the majority of youth groups, I feel, come under civil society or NGOs, and seldom, we see the public or private sector collaborating together with these groups in Solomon Islands, that is. And I think what is important here is understanding that where these groups can come together, what are the driving factors that will bring them together, and really defining what sort of roles each of these groups can perform. So having sort of like an overarching body of framework that defines these things and brings everyone together on the same page, working towards the same thing is so important, and I have not seen much of yet. So yeah, hopefully we can lead into something like that soon. Thank you.
Awesome. Me next, I'm guessing. So thank you for that, guys. I actually do want to agree with Dylan there. I've just spent the day on a pineapple farm, a cotton farm, and a sweet potato farm actually up here in Rockhampton. And there's a lot of talk going on at the moment about, okay, what can we as young people who are entering into this agricultural sector, I guess in a professional capacity, do to mitigate climate change? And they're looking at some really unique things at the moment around how do we bring cropping and livestock sectors together and make them benefit each other. So they're talking about, planting peanut crops and using the leaves from that and the greens from that to feed cattle, and talking about solar panels. Can we raise them and have them on our agricultural land spaces here in Queensland, and mitigating heat stress for cattle and things like that. And so in turn, we're obviously doing rotational grazing and things like that, so that adds to keeping our precious topsoil and things like that too. So I just wanted to make that connection there, because that's sort of where I come from, I guess, within my climate change space. Obviously being an Aboriginal woman, climate change and connection to country has always been massive to me. So innately, I've always had this need to care for country. That's how I was brought up. That's how all my cousins, brothers and sisters were brought up too. We come from the land, you belong to the land doesn't belong to you. So you need to take care of it because we live on it, and we return back to it when we pass away and we die. And we're caretakers, and we're here to caretake the land because it gives so much to us. So within my own personal business, Groove Co, I focus a lot on connecting our young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to country, and providing pathways for them to actually enter into the agricultural sector, because I want to see them take their knowledge. We have a lot of traditional knowledge around when to burn, when to leave things. We have a season for everything. So when we're talking about looking at how we can mitigate climate change through regenerative agriculture, that's not a new concept. That's how we worked as Aboriginal people way back when, from the start of time, and we never had the issue of sort of supply and demand. It was always, we never took more than we needed. So going back to those ways and basically upskilling our young people to be able to step into these spaces with confidence so that they can actually take care of the land in these traditional ways in a modern setting, so we can mitigate some of these challenges of climate change. And in regards to how can the public and private sector sort of come together, I really think the key is in research for us. Like, I've seen a lot of people who are very far in their field, who are advanced in their field, willing to take on younger people and bring them up through the ranks and take on their ideas as well. And I think that's where we need to harness it, because not only does it benefit institutions like universities and government, but it also benefits private sectors like farmers, small business, things like that, as to how we can harness those ideas that not only improve business ideas and intersector collaborations, but also benefits mitigating challenges for climate change. So yeah, that's sort of me in a nutshell in that space and my thoughts.
Thank you so much. Sharon?
Hi, everyone. Firstly, before proceeding, I would like to make mention and acknowledge the presence of the PIFS General Secretary, Henry Puna. Thank you for making time. And to all the amazing attendees tonight, thanks for joining us. There are three questions that were asked by Sabrina. And to answer the first question, I've worked on, and I'm working on several climate resilience projects, but for tonight, I would want to focus on the Australian Humanitarian Partnership Disaster Ready project, which is currently implemented by World Vision Solomon Islands. So this project aims to build resilient communities so that they are better prepared for rapid and slow onset disasters through institutional and partnership coordination, capacity building and trainings, and also gender inclusivity. The project was initiated in 2020 and is still currently running in Makura province in the Solomon Islands. It covers specifically 8 communities. Some activities that are implemented and we're implementing under this project include tropical cyclone and tsunami simulation drills, first aid trainings, awareness and trainings on disaster risk reduction and how to develop disaster plans at the community level, and also an introduction of smartphones for weather updates and early warning systems in these communities. The second question is, what was the role of young people in this initiative? Gender mainstreaming is a priority in our projects here in World Vision, because this is very important, because it is a requirement from our donors. One of our activities through this project was the establishment of village disaster climate risk committees, or we call them the VDCRC. So the VDCRC was responsible for developing disaster plans at the rural level, and they also coordinate meetings and communication between the project team and other stakeholders at the village level. These VDCRCs were then linked with the Provincial Disaster Management Office and also the National Disaster Management Office. We ensured that young people and gender mainstreaming was implemented in these VDCRCs. So we have like youth representatives, we have like people with disabilities, and women and men in the community represented in these VDCRCs. The last question is, how do you think the public and private sector can harness youth voices to drive climate actions in Australia and in the Solomon Islands? Before proceeding, I want to state that Solomon Islands currently has an existing and valid national youth policy, which sets the overarching long-term vision and mission for youth development and empowerment in the Solomon Islands within the framework of our national disaster strategy, development strategy, and the sustainable development goals. The National Youth Policy's fourth priority outcome is sustainable development by 2030. And this implies youth empowerment and re-equipping youths for them to be effective catalysts and enablers of sustainable development in the Solomon Islands, strengthening resilience to natural disasters and climate change, and ensuring food, water, energy security, and green and blue initiatives are implemented in this country. So how can we get public and private institutions and also NGOs to start harnessing youth potential? What I think and what I believe is one of the strategies is for donors and partners to make it a priority and a requirement for gender and youth mainstreaming and inclusivity in the projects that they fund for resilience in the Solomon Islands or in Australia or any other Pacific country. Let me give you an example. Our donors, for instance, differ. They make it a priority that we must mainstream youth and gender into our projects. So because we want our projects to continue, we will automatically put that as a priority as well in implementing our projects. Secondly, public institutions can incorporate gender and youth voices by engaging youth to be part of development of the national NDCs, nationally determined contributions. NDCs are a requirement under the Paris Agreement, where each country that is a member of or signed the Paris Agreement must submit an NDC every 5 years. We can engage young people from the Solomon Islands and Australia to be part of the NDC. According to a study that is recently done by IUCN, 78% of those people who have submitted the NDCs mention at least gender in their NDCs and youth. I'm not sure about Australia, but for Solomon Islands, we are yet to submit our NDC. We are due for one. So this is an amazing opportunity where we can get young people to come together and demand that they mainstream gender and youth into our NDC, because without us prioritizing that, we won't implement anything in terms of youth voices in the national level. So it is very important that we have youth and gender mainstream into our national determined contributions, or NDCs for short.
Thank you so much.
And lastly, we need to provide a platform where young people can share and voice their concerns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you everyone for your insights and perspectives. It is fantastic to hear about how you're making a tangible difference in climate resilience outcomes. So the next question goes to Dylan. Sorry, we're a bit short of time, so I'm kind of rushing through this a little bit. As a young Australian who has been active in the Pacific working on food security, you have firsthand adaptation and resilience challenges that many farmers are facing. How do you think Australia and the Solomon Islands can strengthen cross-country research project collaboration to advance regional climate solutions?
Thank you, Sabrina. Yeah, that's a really good question and a complex question. I'll start by saying that farmers are the real drivers in climate resilience and adaptations. They're usually the hardest hit by changes to climate. So for food production, we need a stable climate, pretty much, as most of our food systems are impacted directly by the climate and the weather. If a farmer is producing a crop, it is very vulnerable to flooding, droughts, in Australia, fire. So there's all these challenges, and farmers at the forefront of that. So most farmers are very wanting action on climate and wanting investment and funding into research and development to ensure that their and our food systems are protected. I think it is important for Australia and Solomon Islands and other places around the world to realise that a lot of our challenges facing food security are shared challenges, and to value differing perspectives and different ideas. I think that we can increase cross-country research and partnerships, and ensure that projects are being farmer-focused and locally led. For example, Australia is supporting projects in Solomon Islands with the Australian Centre for International Ag Research. I think there is potential to increase funding and infrastructure and research capabilities, and also potential to better support education and to strengthen our partnerships. So I think research and development is going to be a kind of a big area that the two countries can foster into the future. And also, I think kind of leveraging off Zhanae talking before about valuing Indigenous kind of knowledge and perspectives. And hopefully that's something that's beginning to change here in Australia. So just in terms of my PhD research, it's a project being led by a traditional owner group, the Dja Dja Wurrung people of Central Victoria, who have the vision to return culturally important food plants to the landscape. And they have generations and generations of knowledge of how to sustainably manage the land and food systems. So I think it's going to become increasingly important for Australia to realise the importance of Indigenous knowledge into the future and share that, and can be shared with Pacific nations such as Solomon Islands. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights and perspectives, Dylan. So now, Gladys, you have been featured internationally for your climate advocacy. What initiatives would you like to see implemented in the Solomon Islands to allow youth to participate actively in advancing climate change efforts?
Thank you, Sabrina, and thanks, Dylan, for those insights. I really agree that cross-country research, for the funding, capacity building, all this is so important for our young people to be involved more. And in a lot of my international sort of features, I've been inspired so much by what other young people are doing all around the world. Like, everyone's doing amazing things, and everyone's so creative in their space, doing very different things, but all sort of ultimately coming towards this one goal of, increasing climate action and fighting for climate justice. And for me, I guess, leading on from what I was saying earlier in terms of collaboration, I feel strongly that whilst we're still defining a lot of the roles of different groups and how we can come together, I feel our government needs to be held accountable, and be, to know that it is an obligation and they are obligated to support us. And at this stage, I look at the Ministry of Environment, for example, in Solomon Islands, and I see all of the good work that they're doing, such as, in vulnerability assessments that they're doing in communities to become part of what is called the National Adaptation Plan that we have in our country. But I'm also wondering, okay, but how can they get our youth to be part of this good work that they are doing? Maybe they could call various youth leaders that are doing climate work around the country to come together, discuss what their agenda is, where are they on, where's the government on, what are they doing, how can youth come in to help them achieve these goals together, and then the same when they go into community. And a lot of the time I feel, as Solomon Islanders, or just in general, when our governments are not helping, we're like, oh, government can't do much, so let's look at other things. Let's look at other ways that we could help our country, because the government is unlikely to do much. But really what we're doing is we're not holding our governments accountable and getting them quickly on, inside to really push for that support that we need from the government. So hence why I'm really advocating for this. Another thing that we can do also involving the government is to say, for instance, involve the Ministry of Education and get climate education to be part of our curriculum from primary school all the way up to high school. Instead of just being a subject within a subject, it has to be a subject on its own, teaching people to know what our rights are, know that these things that we're facing isn't normal. And I think that can also be done in Australia to help educate young Australians to understand this better as well, so that when they, grow up and they come into positions of power and influence, they can definitely push for better support from Australia coming towards Pacific Islanders that are also facing these issues, but then also Solomon Islanders helping Australia as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gladys, for sharing your thoughts about harnessing the role of youth projects. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat. And then if we have time at the end of the webinar, we can ask the questions to the panelists. So now moving on to Zhanae. First Nations Australians have been utilising traditional Indigenous techniques to address climate change for centuries. What role do you see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians having in addressing climate change across Australia and the Pacific region?
Very good question. Thank you so much. So I have a few thoughts on this one. So first of all, like I said before, and also, again, Dylan, I want to address, I think there's much more conversation to be had between us about some things in the ag space. Very exciting to hear that around your PhD studies. That's very cool. But yeah, look, like the question said, we've always, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, been at the forefront of caring for our environment. Like, it's just innately ingrained within us that we have to care for our environment. And our practices, our traditional practices, which are treasured and sacred to us, go back, over 60,000 years ago. And those have been passed down from generation to generation. So I think what's happening is that we tend to, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, sit back and wait for people to come to us for our knowledge, instead of being out there actively being like, come on, let's jump on board, let's do this. I mean, there definitely are people leading the way in that space, but I think what needs to happen is government needs to come to the table and co-design solutions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So co-design strategies of, what we've done isn't working, or we could do this better. Like, you have called this place home for over 60,000 years. What have you seen? What's been passed down, from generation to generation? Things like, we're talking about how we backburn, or I guess it's called backburning now, but we called it fire stick farming, and knowing when to burn to regenerate new growth. Again, I go back to the regenerative farming and how that was a practice that we've had for many, many centuries, knowing the cycles of the weather and the climate of the earth, and just going back to our core values of needing to respect and protect the earth. So I think that's something that we can bring to the table. And I think if that isn't co-designed or passed down, then that knowledge isn't used to the best of its ability. Also, I think at times, like, agriculture can be a little bit gatekept by the industry, by the major players in the industry. So I think opening that gate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is a massive step forward, because I have a lot of young people specifically who want to care for country, but don't have a pathway to care for country, don't think university is for them, don't want to move away from home and go work on someone else's property because they get homesick too easy. So finding pathways that work for our young people so that they can use their natural abilities in that space to benefit everybody. But in relation to how we can work collaboratively, with Australia and the wider Pacific, I think. I just came back from the Young Pacific Leaders Conference over in Hawaii, and that sort of opened my eyes up to the fact that we do need to collaborate. But for a couple of different reasons. I think shared strategies can come after we build relationships, because I think once you build relationships across the Pacific, you have that connection, and then you have a responsibility, a social responsibility to everyone else in the Pacific to look after one another. And I think that's something that's missing for our young people, especially our First Nations young people in Australia. They're not exposed to those opportunities to connect with the wider Pacific. And it's such a missed opportunity, because we, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, have a very shared similar history to everyone else in the Pacific. And I think that needs to be our basis of our connection, is because we understand, it was amazing for me going over, because I'm like, I feel a little less burdened around the problems that we have, because we're facing it, as a team in a sense. But now I also have the opportunity to engage in shared learning. So we're not reinventing the wheel, we're working smarter, not harder. So I think that's where we need to put First Nations people to push for the opportunities and create the pathways to not only engage with the wider Pacific, but also get into the agriculture industry, because there's just no, I guess, suitable pathways at the moment for our young people to do that and to have the confidence to do that. So that's my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Zhanae, for giving your insights about using Indigenous knowledge for climate action. So now moving on to Sharon. You have represented the Solomon Islands as the youth representative at the UN COP. As a youth ambassador for the Solomon Islands, what has your experience collaborating internationally, and how can the Pacific address these issues together with Australia?
Thanks, Sabrina. So Solomon Islands is one of the most vulnerable countries internationally in terms of climate change impacts. And this is also true for other Pacific countries. Yet we have the smallest representation at the United Nations Conference of Parties level. I believe other nations, other Pacific nations will say the same. At COP26, for instance, we have several thematic areas that certain representatives within the delegation follow. Solomon Islands has less than 10 people on the delegation last year. And this implies we are missing out in terms of proper effective representation at the international level, because there are some thematic areas that we don't really have anyone to follow. So I want this to change for COP27 in Egypt. I want a better representation of young people and Pacific Islanders, because while we are talking, some people say that, it's just COP, it's just talk and talk. But if you want to motivate young people and leaders to come back and implement at the rural level, you have to send them there so they can witness what is happening in there, and they can represent Indigenous people and represent our voices. And especially like at the thematic level, this is not a joke. Like when we don't have someone following a thematic area, it means we don't have a voice in that thematic area. Then we miss out on decisions that are being made in that area. So I'm appealing to whatever regional organizations that are being part of this call, or the Australian government. Let's partner in the Pacific, and let's send more people to COP27. Youth representatives, people, gender, let's include everyone, and let's go together and not just select people randomly, select people that will bring back impact and change communities. That is what I would want to say. Secondly, I would like to encourage Australia, Solomon Islands, and other Pacific youths that are on this call this evening to go and sign up on Yango. I realized that there's less representation of Pacific Islanders in that group. Yango is the only youth constituency to the UNFCCC. So you can go and sign up. Once you sign up, you can see all the activities that are happening internationally within the youth space in terms of climate action. And I believe if we have more people in this area, then we can be able to organize regional conference of youth in the Pacific. And from there, we can bring it down to local conference of youth, where we can have a paper that we can bring together to the table. So when we go out to represent our Pacific countries, we have a paper, we have a voice, we have something to stand for, and we have the same thing to talk about. So yeah, that's from me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for your perspectives and work in climate change, both in Solomon Islands and further abroad internationally. So we will now open the floor to questions from the audience. I can see, I think Annabelle asked the question earlier on during the session. I guess I can ask that to the panelists. I'm just going through the chat at the moment. Okay, so Annabelle has asked, I want to know how young people can have a say and have their voices heard when government control and influence is so strong right now. Is there a space for collaboration between the two teams in terms of the future for Solomon Islands? So I'm assuming this is for Gladys and Sharon. So I guess either of you.
Sharon, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Uh,
Go ahead, Gladys.
Okay. Sorry. Let me just read the question again. What is it? How can? Okay, so with the government control and influence is so strong right now. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I feel like I've been asking myself this question like over and over again as well. Coming out to like attend all of this like international events, I'm really like amazed at how some young people and youth in other countries have really taken their government on board to support the work that they're doing. So like but a lot of the time when you ask this youth what's happening, there is their own government actually goes to them and brings them on board rather than the other way around. And I think that is something we need from our side as well. Like youth have a lot of good work that young people in Solomon Islands and other countries like Pacific countries, Australia, like young people is doing amazing things. But a lot of the time it's isolated from, say, what the Ministry of Environment is doing. And I think what would be really good is if our leaders, and acknowledging SG here today, like we need at least leaders to be listening into us and seeing where we would like them to also support us. Because when we're looking at the government, like they are the like high level authorizing body. Like a lot of you don't know how to just approach them and say, oh, can you help me in this, or where can we help you in that, because they are really high level. So what is important is if they can also see that we are wanting to help and take us seriously, and come down to us and engage us with the work that they are doing. I think that's important. And in all of the success stories that I've heard and the amazing like youth that are working overseas, that is what the governments are doing. So for example, like in Uganda, this Ministry of Environment youth leader, he was in his office and one day he walks out and there's this big green truck, right? And it says youth go green, and he was wondering like what's happening there, like what's going on. He approaches them and they tell them how they are basically going around planting trees in the communities, and he didn't know about that. And so he was like, oh, are you doing this for climate change? And they didn't know about climate change either. So then what he did is he brought them into his office, he educated them about climate change and about how what they're doing is actually really, really important. And then from then on, he managed to like get the youth on board to the point where they've actually got a space in Parliament with youth representatives in there, and being part of very important decision-making processes. And I think that's what we can do too. We can learn from that. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Gladys. Sharon, did you want to say something?
Yes, thanks, Gladys, for your response. I just want to elaborate on that. And yeah, I believe the time for isolation is over, where we have government ministries working by themselves. We have the youth ministries working by themselves. We have the women's ministry working by themselves. It is time to collaborate. It is time to implement. We are tired of talking. It's time to implement. It's time to walk the talk. We have the high-level people in the Ministry of Environment go and sign off these international agreements. So we have the international agreements to support our stand. Young people, we need to rise up. We need to know that we have policies internationally, we have national policies and laws to support our stand, to be part of the process. It is our time that we demand that we have a seat on the table. And one of the in the Solomon Islands, one opportunity is the upcoming nationally determined contributions. This is a very important document where we will submit to the UNFCCC, where it outlines what Solomon Islands is going to implement in terms of its action plan, in terms of fighting, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and what we're going to do in the next 5 years. So we have our table here. We can negotiate, we can talk, collaborate with the Ministry of Environment and other relevant stakeholders and ensure that they mainstream young youth and also gender into our upcoming NDC. And for Australians and other Pacific Islanders that are watching tonight, I encourage you to go back and read your NDC and figure out if they include young people. Because if there's no young people in there, we are missing out. So read that and identify if your country has included gender and young people in their NDCs. If not, then it's your time to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We also just got a new question in. I'm just popping that. Okay, so we have a question from Alex. I think everyone in the panelists can answer this. So he has asked, how can we involve the grassroots people at the community level into the projects that have mentioned, because they are at once the mostly affected by climate change in terms of agriculture? And how can we monitor whether these projects or initiatives are actually works in the community level in terms of climate change adaptation and resilience?
I can speak to that a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
So great question. I think the point that's important here is to let young people lead. We are ready, but we need to be supported in taking up those actions. So we don't need, government to lead the way in this. We need to say, okay, what do these young people want to do at a community grassroots level? I'm a big believer in that's where all the work starts. It should come from the ground up. It shouldn't come from the top down. I believe it should come from the ground up, all change, and government should meet us in the middle. I think that's what needs to happen. So I think grassroots wise, we need to let our young people lead. We're ready to do that. And we just need systems supported in place to do that. So whether that's from NGOs, whether that's from other community members who, have experience in that field and are happy to support us in that space, but let us lead and let our ideas, no matter how, bizarre they might sound at the start, just let them go ahead and see what they turn into. And in regards to measuring whether that changes on the ground, I'm a big advocate for using your own frameworks in community. So for example, we did a project in a different sector and we found that no reporting frameworks were fitting us because we reported and recorded our information in such a different way. It wasn't all straight facts and statistics. There were also stories and sort of case studies that weren't being captured in the data that we had. So we came up with our own framework of how we wanted to report on things. And that was really valuable to us because then we were able to take those frameworks and how we reported on our grassroots project and take that to higher levels of government and go, well, it's working. This is how we're reporting on things and this is how we've measured it. And this is the project that's happening, a place-based co-design strategy. Here you go. And then progress happens from there. And a very good example of that was sort of not in the agriculture space, but it can be adapted to the climate change space. We had a youth forum and we had 150 young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people come together, and this was community-led, grassroots-led. And we got a lot of young people in the room to hear their voice on things like, education, youth justice, child safety, all of those sectors, climate change, things like that. And that was something government wasn't able to do. So I think leaving it with community and knowing that community can handle their business. I think that's what's often missed. We can handle our own business. Let us lead the way. So yeah, that's my suggestions around that.
Yeah, I'll just jump on there and just add a couple of things quickly. I agree with Zhanae that that grassroots approach is very much needed. There's no real point, and I think a lot in terms of agriculture that a lot of projects don't consult with farmers to begin with can go throughout its whole project cycle and then come up with ideas and solutions, but then farmers don't necessarily adopt them because they aren't actually addressing the problems that they have because they weren't consulted. So I think throughout that whole process of a project that aims to address a problem needs to first understand the problem fully. So then take farmers and youth, for example, throughout the whole process and then through to the end of the project and the evaluation and monitoring process. So it's just we have all the important perspectives and voices at the table the whole way along.
Thank you so much, Dylan. We also have a question from Brian. His question is, how can we involve the rural communities, all the villages that is less educated and is affected by the climate change at this moment? to anyone.
Sorry, I know I've already talked, so please feel free to cut me off.
No.
I'm specifically for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, like our remote communities for us, who are perhaps less educated or don't have, access to education, don't understand it completely. For us, it comes back to the basics of connection to culture. So that's how we get our mob involved. So basically, we go back to things as simple as, let's do, a connection to culture session. So I'll take kids out, or they can do it themselves. We go out and sit by the river, connect to country, do some of our like collapse stick meditation stuff that we do to connect to culture and to our old people and ancestors. And then from that's where the conversations come from. So I think for us, what I've found the important link is, if connection to culture or country has been lost, it's first re-establishing that link and then building on that with small conversations that obviously build on top of that, and then it's up to our community to have the self-determination to progress it from there. But that's the link that I found that works when there's maybe a lesser level of education involved.
Thank you so much, Zhanae. Can we, if any of the panelists want to have a final say before we wrap up for this evening?
Yeah, I would like to say, add on to what Zhanae just said. Yeah, I think it's really important to like connect culture on the ground as a sort of like a starting point for young people and just everyone in the community in general to come together. But also, adding on to what Dylan and Sharon have said, involving the community in like, for example, getting the farmers' opinions, but also involving in the actual documents that are out there that will go far and, have our say and have our voices being heard, like the NDCs. But what really is important as well, I think, is having all this information accessible, like, communicated in a way that our grassroots people will actually understand it and will be able to be part of these, important things that we are doing. A lot of the time, the information that comes to us is actually not in the language that our local people or grassroots people will understand. Like even sometimes myself, as an educated person, I read some of these papers and I'm like, what is going on here? Like, I don't really understand what they're trying to communicate and how we're supposed to come in and help. So imagine someone who's less educated, for instance, like this is even harder for them. And so I think one way that we could definitely bring together the grassroots community and having their input and their voices heard is to provide all our information in or communicated in a way that they will understand it and they will be on the same picture as an educated person or someone, a policymaker would be, for example. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Does anyone else want to say something? If not, I'll just wrap up. We are on time. So thank you so much to everyone, especially to our special guests as well for attending, and our panelists for sharing with us some very good insights once again. I'd also want to thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm sure that you're all inspired and motivated by the insights shared and obviously have more questions to ask, and feel free to message them individually. I'm sure they have their social medias. But yeah, thank you for everyone taking your time out to attend our online webinar. We hope we can continue this conversation in the future and use these opportunities to discuss relating to youth across the Pacific and Australia. Make sure you also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to keep updated with our latest news and content. But for now, tagya tumas everyone, and good fala night lo you fala. Tagya.
Thank you.